Sola Gratia. Sola Gratia surpasses the consequences of sin. Reading Paul's theology of grace in Romans 6:14. Introduction. In some versions of the Bible, the word grace occurs 21 times in 18 verses in the book of Romans. The concept undergirds almost all of Paul's theological thinking throughout the entire letter to the Romans. Paul's explanation of the gospel in Romans is centered by his own personal understanding of God's grace, Romans 1:5. He had first received it himself, and now he has rethought everything in light of his own personal transformation. He then preaches that the grace that is received has the obligation to share. This article is prompted by the biblical fact about human sin and its consequences that are laid across the Bible. By virtue of the consequences set in Romans 6:23, the wages of sin is death, a retribution, which I call it consequences of sins, are inevitable. However, I argue from the Pauline point of view in agreement with my personal conviction that the grace of God is sovereign over the imagined consequences of sin. In the discussion below, I will lay Paul's theology of sin and grace, specifically in Romans, and exegete to show how the grace of God supersedes the curse of sin. Following this introduction, I have written something about Paul's theology of grace in the book of Romans, and then Paul's theology of sin in the book of Romans, after which the interplay of grace and sin in Paul's theology. After that, I look specifically to the historical and the experiential background of Paul's letter to the Romans. Then I go on doing intensive exegesis on Romans 6:14. Then I come to the literal analysis of the text, explaining the key phrase in the whole Romans, basically verse 14 in chapter 6. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under law, but under grace. This literal analysis is given. After that, I go on to say, Sola Gratia surpasses the curse of sin. After which, I give the concluding appraisal on the theme. It is sola gratia, not human frailty, meaning to say, it is grace alone, not sin. Let me read the concluding appraisal. Human frailty refers to the inherent physical, moral, or psychological weaknesses and vulnerabilities common to people, encompassing aspects like physical weakness, emotional instability, and a tendency towards error, ignorance, or greed. It describes human vulnerability and susceptibility, highlighting the general human condition of imperfection and the inability to fully meet one's own high standards or avoid mistakes and negative behaviors. In other words, the term human frailty broadly describes the limitations and imperfections that define the human experience. It acknowledges our susceptibility to physical decline, our tendency to make mistakes, and our struggle to consistently uphold our own ideals. Likewise, despite the clarity of Paul's word, the wages of sin is death. I have always had this thought: if God can change the destiny, the consequences of a person's frailty and sin, or in other words, can God change the destiny of the consequences of a person's sin? In my informal discussions with a colleague and others, I have learned from a colleague, and also like majority believes, that the grace of God cannot cancel the consequences or earthly punishment. However, the grace delivers us from eternal condemnation. Thus, the grace of God grants us forgiveness, redeems and transforms us, although we're not spared from punishment. In one of my discussions with a senior ordained minister, L. Among Pom, he says, there is grace greater than our sins. Any sin has great weight. The wages of unforgiving sin brings death. God never curses anyone just at random. If a man is cursed by God, then there is no remedy. I believe there is no grace beyond curse. The curse has end in itself. What El Among Pom wanted to actually say is that curse has its end in itself. Curse is the end in itself. There is no other means. That's the end. That's the point of death. That's the death end to a person. Hence, grace ends prior to being cursed. What is intriguing from what Pom say is the phrase, I believe there is no grace beyond curse. The curse has end in itself. How do we understand this? Perhaps the idea is that if one is cursed, that's the end of everything. Meaning, there is no realm of grace beyond what is being cursed. If the grace of God so applies actively and profoundly, it does exist, regulates prior to being cursed. What I mean to say is, if grace exists prior to being cursed, I would understand that God can change the destiny. Therefore, ultimately, the grace applies actively in the context when human can be forgiven, in the moment when human can be made justified, in the situation when human can be made righteous. That would mean grace is abiding and present even at the point in time when human deserves to be cursed, yet not cursed, but grace surpasses the punishment. In this layer of my thought, the theology of the finished work of Christ on the cross applies to only those who believe themselves are justified, especially in the realms of souls being justified. As a matter of fact, the unconditional grace keeps even the ones who do not believe in the grace of Jesus on the cross guarded by it. Therefore, what I believe is that the unmerited grace of God illuminated on the cross adds to the reality of God's salvific acts extended to everyone, both body and soul of humankind. Paul's emphasis on the grace of God is paramount. Paul is careful enough to incorporate the message of sin and its consequences, lest believers might take advantage of the free gift of grace. While the two themes, grace and sin, interplays, what gives this article a conviction for further thought is the surpassing power of the grace of God, the unmerited justification of a sinner from penalty, both spiritual and physical. So in this paradigmatic reading, I have the proposition that the grace of God supersedes those awful consequences and destiny and can change your life. This disposition is solely at the mercy of God, His will, and the purpose for a person's life. While the heart and the intention of God cannot be fathomed, yet the grace of God is experienced by both faith and factual evidences that human encounter in one's walk of faith with God. This is when I call the unmerited grace of God that surpasses or applies beyond the consequence of sin. God bless people who come across this article and is read. Very soon, this article will be published by an organization, Christian organization at Sikkim, India.